evict a tenant is by going through a court process where the tenant can respond. And then if the landlord wins in court, they can get a court order that allows the sheriff to lock the tenant out. So there's never a situation where the landlord is allowed to change the locks or turn off the water or the power to force somebody out. So even if you get an eviction notice from your landlord, that doesn't mean you just have to pack up and leave. You have rights, and we're going to talk about how you can get assistance in enforcing those rights. So if you do receive a notice from your landlord, and I'm speaking as if I'm speaking to tenants, I know we have lots of people in different roles here, but if a tenant receives a notice from their landlord saying that they have to move out, this can be titled a notice to quit. Quit means leave. An eviction notice or a pay rent or quit notice, any of these things, seeking help from an attorney is the first thing that you want to do. And this website here, maybe we can also drop this in the chat, Law Help CA. That is a website that provides information about local legal services. So whatever area you're in, you can go to the website and find where nearby is there a legal services program that I can get help from, and free legal services for low income folks. So that's a really good resource, because if you do get an eviction notice, it's important to respond. So going to that website will help you get information about how to respond. Okay, so the different laws that we're going to cover today, and I think one more thing I want to say is that there also are penalties for landlords who violate these rules. It can be hard to enforce them, but there are laws that say that landlords have to pay tenants and they have to have consequences if they violate the law and try to lock a tenant out. So there are protections in place. Okay, so the laws we're going to talk about today that protect people during COVID. The first one is the CDC order. Everyone refers to it this way. The CDC is referring to the Centers for Disease Control. So that's a federal agency that usually does things with like medicine and drugs, but because the entire Trump administration has done nothing to protect people from evictions, suddenly the CDC said, oh, okay, we'll do something about evictions. So they issued this order that says that people who have lost income during COVID and can't pay because of that can't be evicted until December 31st. We'll talk more about how to use this protection later, but that's what we're talking about when we talk about the CDC order. That's something that applies in the whole country, and it's supposed to stop evictions until December 31st. The thing that we're going to spend more time talking about today is our state law, AB 3088. I don't know why the name is hard to say, but this is our state law that's all about COVID protections. And the protections in this law are more helpful because they permanently protect people who can't pay rent from being evicted. You have to follow pretty complicated procedures in order to be protected from this, but AB 3088 allows a tenant to be protected from eviction permanently, even if they are not able to pay. And we'll talk about how you are able to use these protections and kind of explain all the different steps to follow to make sure that you can be protected. In addition to these general laws, a lot of cities and counties in California have passed even better protections, like I know LA, Berkeley, Alameda County, there are better protections for tenants, but we're not going to talk about those in detail today because it applies differently throughout the state. But if this is something that you're dealing with or that you're helping people dealing with eviction, it's really important to check to see if there's a local law that's providing even more protection for you. So in general, most of these COVID protections work in the same way. The tenant is required to give their landlord a declaration about why they can't pay rent. A declaration is just a sworn statement. It's saying, I'm promising to tell the truth. When I sign this document, it's true. And as with anything, when someone is interacting with their landlord, it's really important to keep proof of submitting a declaration like this. So the declaration for 3088 it specifically says, I can't pay rent because I lost income because of COVID, or I'm going to go back to that other slide, Sasha, sorry. And so it's like the tenant is signing a piece of paper saying, this is why I can't pay, and giving it to their landlord. And it's really important to like take a picture of it or keep a copy or some other way. You need to be able to prove that you've given this to your landlord. And this is the case with anything when you're interacting with a landlord, because you don't want them to go back and say, oh, I never got that. They never gave it to me. So you always take a picture, keep some proof, write down when you gave it to the landlord, how you gave it to the landlord, so you can really have all the details to prove that you were able to do that. And under our state law, AB 3088, to get the eviction protections, you have to submit this declaration saying, I lost income because of COVID, or I had more expenses because of COVID, and you have to submit it to your landlord every month that you can't pay. So that can be a little bit tricky because it's not just sending it once, but it's every single month. And under each of these laws, there's a specific declaration that says like certain words. It has to be exactly the same wording that's in the law. And we'll point again later on to where you can get information about this and where you can get the exact wording. And the other really important thing for people to understand about all of these laws is that none of them cancel rent. That's what we all want, right? We want the rent to just be erased and canceled, but that is unfortunately not what happens under these laws. What these are saying is even though you can't pay, you will not be evicted, but you still do owe that money. The idea is that the money owed can't be the basis for an eviction, but it still is sort of sitting there and the landlord can collect it in another way, like by going to small claims court. We're not going to kind of focus on that, but it's important to understand that the rent is not canceled. Okay, this is heading over to Sasha. You want to take over from here?
Yes, so that takes us to AB 3088, which is the sort of main state law that's going to apply when folks are trying to protect tenants from eviction. AB 3088 is mostly about non-payment evictions. As we know, there are all kinds of evictions. There are no-fault evictions. There are evictions because you violated your lease. It does touch on some of those, but it mainly addresses the unpaid rent and sort of how that gets treated for tenants going forward. Really important, there are basically two time periods that AB 3088 deals with. This bill was passed on the last day that the legislature had to act in September. And so it treats sort of rent that accrued before that differently than rent going forward through January. So for rent between March 1st, basically when the whole pandemic sort of got into full swing, I guess you could say, for rent between March and the end of August of this year, if a renter gets a notice from their landlord saying you owe me rent and you haven't paid, and so you have to either pay me or move out, that notice will come along with the declaration that Madeline was talking about. And so for rent between March and August, if the tenant returns that declaration stating that they had a financial loss because of COVID, they can never be evicted for not paying that rent. Again, that doesn't mean that that rent disappears. It turns into what we call consumer debt, which means that the landlord can pursue the money, but they cannot evict the tenant from their home because they didn't pay that money. For rent between September and the end of this coming January, there's an additional requirement. If the tenant completes the declaration and by the end of January, they pay 25% of what they owe, they are also forever protected from eviction. And that is a cumulative 25%, meaning that it's not that each month on the first you have to pay 25%, but it's by the end of January. Nobody can be evicted before the end of January if they've returned this declaration. And then if they also pay that 25%, they will be permanently evicted. Even if a tenant cannot afford to do that, it's important to know that they're also protected from the eviction case getting started before February 1st if they sign and return that declaration each time they get a notice. So there are several kinds of notices that this law sort of creates and deals with. The first is just a statement of people's rights. So the landlord is supposed to give, it's a pretty long notice, but it's supposed to sort of describe all of these protections so that tenants find out about them, because it's one thing to write a law, it's another thing to make sure that everybody knows about the law and how it works and is able to use it in order to protect themselves. So landlords are supposed to provide a sort of blanket notice of how this new law works. And then on top of that, if they have a tenant who didn't pay and they want to evict that person, they need to give what, normally we talk about 3-day notices to pay or quit. This law makes it a 15-day notice to pay or quit. And that's business days, which is really important because that means tenants have about 3 weeks, maybe a little bit less, to sort of read this notice, understand it, and respond. People should not feel like the second they get a notice, they need to kind of make a decision and pay a bunch of money. This should provide them time to seek out resources, make sure they understand the notice, and go from there. That notice is supposed to be translated into the tenant's language in a lot of situations if their lease is in a language other than English. And the notice should come with a blank declaration, again, in the tenant's language in most circumstances, that they have suffered financial distress because of COVID, and it should include sort of how the tenant can respond and deliver that notice to their landlord. And I pretty much said all of this already, but tenants who receive that notice should be able, that there is some time, so they should seek legal help right away. We're probably going to say that over and over again. And the reason that we repeat that sort of ad nauseum is because of those local protections that may also apply and kind of layer on top of this state law. If tenants properly sign and return the declaration of financial distress, then they should be protected by AB 3088 from eviction based on unpaid rent. It's really important, again, to keep records of all of this, keep records of any payments that are made, any interactions with the landlords. And then there is a stopgap in the law for tenants who are unable to return the declaration sort of through no fault of their own, or maybe their landlord didn't even give them a copy. There is sort of a second chance to file the declaration in court if the landlord goes forward with an eviction case. But the best thing is to sign and return the declaration when the tenant gets the notice. These are examples that will be listed out in the declaration of what qualifies as financial distress. And it's not that somebody needs to sort of fit perfectly into these. These are really just a list of examples to help people think about this in a very broad way. So it's not just, I was fired because of COVID, or I haven't been able to go to work. This is really a much more broad type of financial distress. This should include, if somebody needed to take time off because they needed to care for a sick family member, or they have increased responsibilities that take them away from work, increased expenses, sort of anything that can be reasonably attributed to this pandemic should qualify as financial distress. So people should think about this very broadly. There are also, as I mentioned, all of those other evictions, right? Cure or quit notices that you're blasting your stereo or things like that. AB 3088 also applies what we call just cause for eviction protections to all tenants in California. Those of you who are familiar with last year's AB 1482, the Tenant Protection Act, know that that was a huge victory that we won, getting just cause for eviction requirements for most tenants in California. But that law had some exceptions and some exemptions and sort of certain types of properties it didn't apply to. With AB 3088, that requirement that landlords need to say why they're evicting somebody, and that needs to be, an allowable reason that is listed out in AB 1482. That requirement has been extended to all tenants. So what that means is that, just because your lease is ending or just because your landlord wants you out, they can't just give you the sort of old no cause eviction notice that doesn't say anything and just says get out. They have to state a reason, and that should give tenants more ability to defend themselves against those evictions and sort of push back on that reason. Also, the CDC order, the federal law that Madeline talked about, which goes through the end of December, also says that tenants who qualify under that order, so they return the declaration, all of that stuff, can't be evicted for reasons that are not their fault. And that means things like the landlord wants to move in, or they want to get out of the rental business, and so they're doing what we call an Ellis eviction. Those things should be prohibited by the CDC order. Madeline, was I going to cover this one? I can't remember.
I don't.
I think this is, yeah, I think this was my last one. Sorry, guys. So as I said, all California renters have this protection until this law ends, which right now is January 31st. I'm going to talk about what happens then in a little while. Just a note that landlords still can pursue the unpaid rent through small claims. That can't happen before March. But again, people cannot be evicted based on the unpaid rent or for no reason at all.
And just to add on one more thing about that rental debt and about these eviction cases, one of the helpful things in 3088 is it says that these cases will be masked. So when if the landlord files a lawsuit saying, I want the unpaid rent back, that case is supposed to remain masked or secret, so it won't hurt the tenant's credit. So the idea behind this is it's supposed to be that not paying your rent during COVID won't harm your credit and make it hard for you to find an apartment in the future. So a little bit more about local laws. I mentioned at the beginning that we're not really going to talk about this in detail because it's just too much to cover. We have so many cities and counties across California, but I just wanted to let people know that, again, that this is an issue because there are some county like LA County and Alameda County, San Francisco, a lot of places have passed these local laws that do different things. Some of them say you have until like March or sometime in the spring to pay rent. Some of them have protections against rent increases. There are all kinds of different laws that are in effect around California protecting people during COVID. And usually the rule is whatever is the best and strongest protection that applies. But in this case, 3088 has a few confusing parts in it that sort of say state law is going to be the rule for everything, even if there's a better local law. So it gets really confusing. And that's one of the reasons that we keep saying, if you get an eviction notice or if your landlord's harassing you, if you're nervous about eviction, please, please, please contact an attorney using that link that we showed you before with the free legal services offices, because it can be really confusing to figure out what law protects you. And sometimes your local law might be really strong and be better at protecting you than other things. So you really want to figure that out. So what is not covered? So we've talked a lot about what happens when you can't pay your rent and you do this declaration, you sign the declaration saying, I can't pay my rent because I lost my job. I can't pay my rent because I have more childcare expenses during COVID. And so therefore I shouldn't be evicted. But there's lots of other reasons that landlords will try to evict tenants, right? And so there are reasons that are still permitted, even if someone has lost income because of COVID. The landlord can still file an eviction case in court saying this tenant violated their lease. And, you know, sometimes the things that we see are just really silly. They are like the tenant is hanging their laundry off their balconies, therefore I want to evict them, like these really dumb reasons. But landlords still technically can file a case saying, I want to evict this tenant for something that has nothing to do with the rent. And when that happens, again, it is really helpful to have an attorney help because sometimes you can prove that the tenant wasn't doing what the landlord says, or maybe even the tenant was doing, maybe the tenant is folding their or hanging their laundry. So what? They don't need to be evicted for that, right? So with legal help, you can still beat back these cases, even if the landlord tries to start an eviction. And then something really important is that a landlord is not allowed to say, oh, I don't like this tenant anymore because they're not paying their rent. So I'm going to make up a reason to evict them. I'm going to pretend that I'm evicting them because my sister is going to move into the house. And I'm going to pretend that's the reason, but it's really because they're not paying rent. So there's specifically in the law a part that says that you're not allowed to retaliate against the tenant for not paying their rent and do another eviction for sort of a fake reason. And there are penalties against landlords that try to do that. Okay. So we're going to keep saying this again and again, sorry, but you hear us now, right? If anyone gets an eviction notice, please go to legal aid. And then as Sasha mentioned, you actually have quite a bit of time to respond. So 15 days, business days is like 3 weeks. And what the landlord is supposed to do is send a copy of the declaration. It's like a blank declaration form that says, I, tenant, lost income because of COVID or had increased childcare expenses or some other reason. And so if that's true for the tenant can sign the declaration, take a picture of it or do some other form of proof and give it to the landlord. And that's their way of saying, hey, you can't evict me because I qualify for this protection. I lost income or I had increased expenses, so you can't go forward with an eviction. And then as we mentioned at the beginning, you do have to do that every single month. And what the landlord is supposed to do is every month that the tenant doesn't pay, send another 15-day notice with another copy of the declaration in the same language as the lease. So, if the tenant did their lease in Spanish and negotiated the lease in Spanish, all these forms are supposed to be in Spanish too. And so every month the tenant has to do a new declaration. And that can be a little bit hard because it's sort of like, okay, you already know that I lost my income, but you have to do it again every month. And then if the tenant does get court papers showing that the landlord is trying to do an eviction, it becomes really important to get legal help right away because the court process can move quite quickly. Okay. So just reviewing this kind of confusing part. So as I mentioned just now, you have to do that declaration saying that you had a hardship because of COVID every month. And then by January 31st, the tenant also has to pay a total of 125% of the rent for the period from September to January. And that again is pretty confusing because it would seem like you have to pay it every month, but you don't. It's okay if you pay absolutely nothing until January 31st, as long as by January 31st, you're paying 125%. So 1 month plus another quarter of rent by that point. And so if you meet those two things, doing that declaration every month, and then doing that hardship, the 25% of the rent and the hardship declaration every month, that means that that rental debt is never going to be the basis for an eviction. So that is a really great protection. It is a little bit hard to kind of follow all these steps, but that means that that money that the tenant was not able to pay, that 75% of the rent, so most of the rent, that can never be the basis for an eviction. So we really hope that people are able to kind of follow these steps so they can get that protection. And one of the things that can be tricky about this is that we don't want the landlord to, so that say the tenant does their whole payment all at once on January 31st, here's my 1 month plus a quarter, here's my rent. We don't want the landlord to try and do some trick where they kind of apply that payment like, oh, that's nice, you gave me all this money, I'm gonna apply that to your rent back from March. So what you wanna do is on the check, write what the rent is for. This is my 25% payment. And we have on our website, on Western Center's website, we have a tenant toolkit that I think we've also shared with Francisco, but that has like a sample letter where the tenant can write, I am sending you this money. This is how this money is going to be applied. It's not for rent back early last year, it's for these months, so that the landlord can't try to do something where they try and apply the money to a different time period. And as we keep saying with, take a picture of the declaration, you always want to keep proof of everything that you do, taking pictures, writing down when you sent the money, when you sent the letter, and keeping proof of everything that you do so that there's no questions about that. Okay, so there are some limitations. We mentioned that the declaration of hardship that tenants sign, it's really broad, right? It includes losing income because of COVID, having increased expenses, childcare issues, and then this big category, anything related to COVID. So that's very broad. But there's also people that have had experiences that had nothing to do with COVID. Someone who got cancer in the middle of COVID, or got in a car accident, or some other reason that their life was sort of derailed and they lost income. So people who are in that category, who are not able to truthfully sign the 3088 declaration, they still may be protected by federal law. So we mentioned before the CDC, the federal government agency that did this eviction protection. Their declaration, they also require that the tenant submit something but it's broader in terms of the income loss. Like it says, I can't pay my rent, but it doesn't have to have anything to do with COVID. So for people who had an experience like getting cancer or a car accident, or who knows, just some other thing that's has nothing to do with COVID, they may still qualify for the CDC protection. And there's also other people who may be protected by this federal law that wouldn't be protected by state law. For example, people who owed rent before March 1st of 2020. So in our state law in 3088, it only kind of applies to rent beginning in March. So people who owed rent before that, they could still be protected by federal law. Or people who their court case, their eviction court case has already kind of run its course and there's already a judgment for the landlord and it's already sort of almost done. The tenant can sort of last minute come into court and say, wait a second, I qualify for this protection from the CDC. I can't pay my rent and I should still be protected. And we have a link here to where you can get the CDC declaration. And there's a lot of organizations that have translated that into many, many different languages. I think it's in like 100 languages or something. So that's another option for folks who do not qualify for the state law, but still want to protect themselves from eviction. And Sasha, I'm having a little trouble accessing my chat for some reason. And I see that there's things in the chat. So I'm sorry if there's questions that I should be answering.
That's okay. I think I've been doing my best to keep track and respond to some, and then I think Francisco's keeping track of the rest, and we can turn to those at the end.
Great.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of legislation, what comes next. So currently the legislature in California is on recess. And they will be coming back in January to do this all again. As we've said, this law, AB 3088, sunsets, meaning that basically it expires and we go back to the old rules at the end of January, January 31st. Everybody who was involved in that process acknowledged, during the sort of development of AB 3088, that was a stopgap measure. As I mentioned earlier, the legislature voted on it the last possible day that they could act. And we know that this is something that they need to turn to and start working on the first day that they come back from their recess in the new year, in the new legislative session. And so what that means is unless the legislature acts to create a new law that will either extend these protections or create new protections, there will be a gap and people will be left unprotected. And we will see, we were all very worried about this, whether you want to call it a wave, tsunami, flood of evictions that was going to happen before 3088 passed. So what we're anticipating, just to give you sort of a preview of what I think January is going to look like and the new year, is that given how important this is, and given that there will be very little time, a month in the legislative world is like a day in normal people time, what we're anticipating is that there will be sort of a limited bill that just deals with the fact that AB 3088 is going to expire, and extends it out, and that the legislature will pass in January. That's not the end of the story, though. The legislative session, well, it goes for 2 years, but the legislative year is sort of, they can pass new laws up through September. And so what we're anticipating, we know that non-payment of rent and these evictions are not the only housing issues that have come up during COVID, or that we have wanted to make progress on for years. There are lots of structural issues that create power imbalances between landlords and tenants. There's all kinds of things that we as housing advocates want to accomplish, right? Including canceling the rent, dealing with the debt that is going to come from people being protected from eviction but not having their rent canceled. So what we're anticipating is that there will be a second bill that gets introduced. It will probably start out as what we call a spot bill, meaning that it'll just be a sentence or two that says, the legislature is intending to address all of these different issues. And then we'll need to work on language and you know, the actual laws that will get us there. But for sort of January, what we're looking at is really immediately dealing with the extension of AB 3088. And I just wanted to sort of talk about some of the really sort of major issues that will obviously be you know, important to everyone, us on the tenant side, and also the landlord groups who will be, you know, advocating and negotiating against us. And so, you know, obviously the biggest thing is going to be the time frame, and making sure that we're extending these protections out for enough time so that we can get either a real solution in place, or you know, we get back into a phase where the state is actually recovering, people are able to get back to work, you know, not leaving tenants sort of holding the bag with no way to deal with all of this unpaid rent or all of this debt. The other, you know, another sort of related issue is how unpaid rent can be collected. So what AB 3088 says right now is that starting in March, landlords can go to small claims court and try to collect the back rent without evicting their tenants. That may be another issue that we are, you know, looking to extend out and delay so that tenants are able to get back on their feet. One thing that I really wanted to touch on, this was probably the most important thing for the landlord groups in AB 3088, was the question of preemption, meaning, does this state law take control over local protections? How do those things interact? And are local governments able to pass ordinances that either give tenants additional protections, reduce that 25%, all of those kinds of things that we would like to see happen? And what ended up happening in AB 3088 was there was a bit of a compromise. The landlord groups essentially wanted to preempt any and all local protections and basically wipe those out and replace everything with just this state law. That would have left a huge gap in terms of sort of eviction cases that aren't related to unpaid rent, the just cause protections that local jurisdictions have put in place, the repayment time periods, all kinds of things that advocates had already fought really hard to win. And we were able to sort of fend off the worst preemption in 3088 by explaining that we couldn't take protections away from people. Now that tenants were relying on local ordinances, it was really unreasonable and unfair to sort of pull the rug out from under their feet like that. Other issues that we will need to try to sort of preserve and hang on to are, you know, that just cause protection that is in 3088 that extends that to all tenants, as well as closing some loopholes and sort of tightening up some of the protection, some of the drafting issues that happened during the last law. What this means for all of us as advocates is that we have some time right now to be pushing for local protections to come in and sort of take the place of AB 3088 when it expires, that are as strong as possible. Here in LA County, we're certainly doing that. We are advocating for a very strong county ordinance that will sort of come in and take the place of this when it expires. Because we don't know, you know, we hope that we can do our best work and advocacy in Sacramento and get the state legislature to understand this problem, to understand how big it is, to put in the strong protections that we need, but we have no guarantees. And I think a lot of folks were left with a bad taste in their mouth when AB 3088 passed, and it wasn't, you know, it has good, important protections for a lot of folks who are able to use it, but it is complicated. It is not comprehensive. It doesn't protect everybody from any eviction while we're in a pandemic. And so, you know, we think it's really important to try to win as many of these local policies as possible in the meantime, so that both, you know, tenants on the ground are protected, most importantly, but also so that we can make the case in Sacramento for a strong state law. We can go to our legislators and say, look, all of these jurisdictions have passed these protections that are, you know, really working to shore folks up, to keep the worst effects of the pandemic from happening, and we can't take that away from people. And so we think that's going to be sort of the really important thing to focus on in the next few months, is shoring up those local protections and getting ready for the fight in Sacramento. With that, I will just turn to, there are a few things we wanted to let folks know about, ways to weigh in on these sort of both state and local protections, and ways to participate in the legislative process. There is a campaign launch coming up that I'll let Francisco describe a little bit more on Thursday. Western Center has created a survey for reporting tenant stories. It's going to be really important that we can go to legislators and say, you know, we heard from all of these people in your district that they're having these problems, and here are their stories, and here's why they need strong protections. Those really do sway legislators a lot, those tenant stories, hearing directly from their constituents. And another way to do that, you know, to weigh in and to speak to your representatives, is to participate in what will be the legislative process. It looks a little weird right now because we're all in a virtual world, but we're still doing our best to have lobby days and set up meetings with key legislators. There will be hearings where folks can voice their support for a bill, send in a letter. There's a lot of ways to get involved in the legislative process to make sure that we get the strongest possible protections. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Francisco and open it up for questions.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Can you hear me, Sasha?
Yep.
Okay. Can you go back just 2 slides? I wanted to make sure that folks saw in the chat, we did include links to the survey capturing tenant stories that you referenced from Western Center, and you have the English and the Spanish surveys there. And we are looking for individual stories. So there's no, in these, as you're filling them out, if the tenant themselves is not the person filling them out, if you could fill that out as if you were the tenant, there will be questions around how to, you know, follow up with the right person if need be. If any of this is gets communicated further. But as you mentioned, Sasha, it's really important that we capture these stories of what's working and what's not, and that information is localized, so that way when we're talking to a legislator, we can say, look, we have this story of this tenant in your jurisdiction, and this is what happened to them, and this is why we need, you know, additional protections, or we need to amend what we have. So just wanted to point that out for folks. And then secondly, after the surveys, again, remind folks that we are going to be having a relaunch basically of this campaign. In many ways, this is the campaign we've been working on since the beginning of the pandemic, you know, trying to fight for, as Madeline said, a comprehensive solution for COVID evictions and debt relief. And as you mentioned, Sasha, we're thinking this is going to take two different legislative efforts. So one thing right in January when the legislature comes back, because this bill is going to expire at the end of January. And then we're going to need to keep on pushing for the more comprehensive solution as well. But because we know that something will have to get passed in January, if folks remember, this bill that got passed had to get passed with 2/3 of a legislators supporting, because we wanted it to go into effect immediately. And for a law to go into effect immediately, you need 2/3 of the vote, 2/3 of the legislators supporting it. And so we're going to be needing that again in January. So please join us this Thursday at 11 if you want to learn more about how you can, your organization can participate in this effort, both for that January fight as well as for the longer throughout the legislative session of fighting that more comprehensive bill that we need. And I included the Zoom meeting info, and I'll be also inviting everybody to the calendar invite. So hopefully you all can join. There were a few questions that came up in the chat, and then I'm going to call on a few other folks to share their question if possible, just so we can dig further into the materials that Madeline and Sasha shared with us. So the first two questions that I wanted to ask you both, Sasha and Madeline, is about the application of AB 3088. There was one question whether AB 38 applies to mobile homes, and another one whether it applies to townhomes. And I know you've shared it in the chat, but if you wouldn't mind responding for the benefit, especially since we are recording this, I don't know if the chat gets recorded, so it'd be great to get an answer to that on the record, or as recorded.
Sure. So it does apply to all of those properties. It doesn't distinguish between mobile homes, townhomes, single-family houses versus apartments. So long as the tenant qualifies, meaning that they were unable to pay because of COVID, and so long as they complete the requirements of the declaration and possibly the 25% payment, everybody is equally protected regardless of sort of what kind of unit they live in.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. Clara, this is Francisco. I don't know if you can get off mute, but I thought you shared a question with me about, and other folks have added this, about the difficulty of really reaching tenants in time, and especially if they are in a perhaps more vulnerable situation. For example, if they're undocumented, how can we make sure that they feel supported enough to be able to not just leave their housing? And I don't know if you could share your full question with the group.
Hi, thank you for this opportunity to ask the question and for hosting this. So my question is, when undocumented folks are given a notice by the landlord, and even though we talk to them that they are protected by the county moratorium, how can we help them understand that they should not be afraid, and what law specifically states that they are protected from landlord harassment?
So there's a few different things that I would say, and this is by no means the full answer. I welcome everyone's thoughts. I know you're all, or many of you are organizers, attorneys, and work a lot with tenants. And this is, generally the sort of power imbalance between landlords and tenants puts our folks in a tough spot. And so I certainly haven't figured out sort of the magic answer to this question. One thing that I always remind people of is sort of, there are general laws that prohibit landlords from harassing and intimidating their tenants and doing things like locking them out or shutting off the utilities, all of that bad behavior that we see. Those apply equally regardless of somebody's immigration status. Landlords are not allowed to do that. And actually, AB 3088, one of the things that we didn't mention is it did increase the penalties for some of that bad behavior. On top of that, there are specific laws in California. There is a specific law that actually Western Center wrote and passed, and I'm blanking on the bill number, but I can figure it out.
291.
AB 291, which prohibits specifically landlords from harassing their tenants based on their immigration status. It prohibits their attorneys from doing that or asking questions about that during a case. And it has very severe penalties for landlords or attorneys who report tenants' immigration status to ICE. So there are, really good protections that are supposed to sort of prevent that bad behavior from happening. Of course, we still see landlords harassing their tenants, but there are a lot of laws that that are out there to specifically designed to curb that kind of behavior. Similarly, in AB 3088, there is no sort of distinction between folks who are documented and folks who are not. It applies equally to all tenants, regardless of status.
If I could just add on a little bit to that, Sasha, everything you said, plus, and I'd love to hear from other folks who are doing this work now. I think organizing has just been such a tremendous way to help with that fear in things that I've worked on. Last year, I was trying to help tenants who were facing an illegal rent increase. Their landlord for all of these buildings owned by the same nasty landlord was raising everyone's rent in a totally illegal way. And many of the tenants were undocumented and were afraid to protest. But the other tenants in the building were documented, and they formed a tenant organization together so that they could use that as sort of a shield. And of course, that organizing in itself can be really scary because it makes the landlord even more mad. But that can be helpful for folks to get together because the landlord can't evict everyone, right? Then they'll lose all their money. So that can be a really powerful way to protect people if there's other tenants that are facing the same kind of conduct. Then getting everyone together and forming a tenant organization is a really powerful way to fight back when people are scared. But I don't know if others, please do add on. Now I can see the chat, I just can't type anything. Karen, do you want to answer too?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm a community organizer here in the East Bay, and I work a lot with immigrants, tenant immigrants. And so, and a lot of undocumented folks, of course. So a big thing is just like stories are a way to convince the assembly and legislative people. Stories are also a good way to talk to our tenants, our undocumented tenants. For example, here in the East Bay, we had a case where an undocumented renter wasn't giving her deposit back, and it was completely unlawful. And with our help, we were able to take this landlord to court, and she was able to get some of that deposit back. And this is a story that I kind of like to tell people here in our area, saying like, look, it is scary, but it's been done before. And, just letting them know that you will be able to help provide that support that they need, but also letting them know that it's been done before. There is undocumented immigrants that have stood up and that have won some battles. And I think, storytelling is a great way to also get those fears out, or at least give them that, give them the idea that it can be done, and maybe a little bit of hope. So that's kind of, I feel like that might help also.
Thank you, Karen.
That's a really good point.
Appreciate that. Yeah. And I think as well that that was one of the reasons why we wanted to do this presentation, because I think you all are engaging and interacting with communities, and the more confident you all are in the rights of your community members, the more you'll be empowered to share those stories. I've got Alex, you have your hand raised, and if I could ask you to share your question.
Thank you. Thanks, folks, for the great presentation. I had a question about passing additional local ordinances. Sasha, I was wondering if you could say more about what the coalition in Los Angeles is specifically trying to get in place, passed through a local ordinance, and also whether you have any recommendations that for groups that do want to try to pass additional protections through a local ordinance that could kick in at the beginning of February, like what to your mind are the most important things that we should try to get in there in order to follow on AB 3088?
So I don't know I can answer the question about sort of the specifics of what's being pushed in LA. What we've been working on kind of up until now was really shoring up our existing ordinance and making sure that that was extended. So there were, just backing up a little bit, some local jurisdictions passed, strong protective ordinances that said, this is in place until the end of the emergency or until, a year from now or whatever. Others did it in this sort of month by month fashion where they said, okay, we're going to put in place an ordinance right now, but we don't know how long this whole thing is going to be going on. So each month we will come back and sort of vote to extend that out an additional month. What happened was that when AB 3088 passed, it kind of cut off the ability to do that, because what it said was any existing stuff that's on the books now, we're not taking away, but going forward, we're going to limit the ability of local jurisdictions to basically deal with the rent. And so what I'm advocating for is that we, what AB 3088 does not say is that you can't pass sorry, that's a bad way to say that sentence. What it allows for is passing an ordinance now that takes effect after it goes away in February. And so that's kind of what I'm advocating for, is that we all are, pushing for strong local ordinances that are comprehensive, meaning that they're not just dealing with the rent, but that they're dealing with maybe all evictions in a health protective way. So, what I would love to see is a blanket ban on any eviction until we're out of this mess. Politically, that can be tricky, right? And it kind of depends on where you are, what you're able to achieve. But really what that's kind of what I'm pushing for, is very strong health protective policies that get us out of, the place that we're in now, where there's a raging virus, nobody can work, nobody can pay the rent. And, all of that can be done to take effect in February, And I think one of the arguments to make with our local representatives is, look what happened last time, and we don't really want to have to deal with that whole mess again. Why don't we get something passed now so that we can be sure that, even if the state kind of fails to do the right thing, we have something in place in our jurisdiction that's going to help, our residents stay afloat.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Alex. And I just wanted to say, I put in the chat that there is a collective that is pushing for this locally in Los Angeles. They're actually having a teach-in on Thursday about what they're proposing. So it's at from 5:30 to 7:30. Let me know if the calendar link invite doesn't work for you. I've been having some trouble with those, but folks can join and then learn more about what's being proposed at the local level in Los Angeles. Were you going to add to that, Sasha?
Nope. That's great.
Okay. Well, I wanted to, I think that brings us to a conclusion. If I'm putting my email in the chat, if you didn't get your question asked or something comes up for you that you want, answered, please don't hesitate. Please shoot me an email and I will either forward it to Madeline or Sasha or get whatever information folks need. I'm hoping that you found this presentation useful. I wanted to thank Sasha and Madeline for your time and efforts in putting this together. Can I get folks to give them a round of applause and some thumbs up? A lot of love. Thank you so much, Madeline and Sasha. Really appreciate this. And then folks should join us on Thursday at 11 a.m. where we're going to talk about what we need to do starting now or continuing to fight for these protections as this pandemic continues. So this presentation has been recorded. It takes it a few hours or a day sometimes for it to get uploaded onto the cloud. As soon as it does, I will be sharing it out with everybody so that you all can share it out again. Okay. Thank you, everybody. And again, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, Francisco, for organizing.
Yes, thank you so
Bye,
much.
everyone.
Thanks everyone for joining. Bye.
Thank you.